The chilling mystery of the vanished daughter in the Hawthorne family portrait, 1849. The oil painting hung in the front parlour of the Hawthorne estate like a window into a world that no longer existed. 5 figures stared out from the gilded frame with expressions frozen in time, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the artist's careful brushwork. Thomas Hawthorne stood tall and severe in his black frock coat, one hand resting on the shoulder of his seated wife, Margaret, whose pale blue gown pooled around her chair like still water. Behind them stood their 3 children, arranged in descending order of age. Jonathan, the eldest at 17, wore the confident smirk of a young man destined for greatness. Beside him, 15-year-old Catherine gazed demurely at something beyond the frame. And there, on the far right, stood 12-year-old Abigail, her small face bright with an expression that seemed to dance between innocence and knowing. That portrait had been commissioned in the spring of 1849, when the Hawthorne family was at the height of their influence in Salem, Massachusetts. Thomas Hawthorne owned 3 textile mills along the Merrimack River and held considerable sway over the town's economic fortunes. The family lived in a 3-story federal-style mansion on Washington Square with imported marble floors, crystal chandeliers shipped from Paris, and enough servants to maintain an illusion of effortless grace. They were the kind of family that appeared in the social pages of the Salem Gazette, the kind that hosted elaborate dinner parties where business deals were made over brandy and cigars, where marriages were arranged and futures decided. But by the autumn of that same year, everything had changed. Abigail Hawthorne had vanished without a trace. The disappearance occurred on October 15th, a Tuesday that had begun like any other. The household staff rose before dawn to stoke the fires and prepare breakfast. Margaret Hawthorne took her morning tea in the solarium while reviewing the day's menu with the housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan. Thomas left for his office at 7:30, his leather portfolio tucked under his arm, his mind already occupied with negotiations for a new cotton shipment from the South. Jonathan had departed 2 weeks earlier to attend Harvard College in Cambridge. Only Catherine and Abigail remained at home, continuing their education under the supervision of their governess, Miss Eleanor Pritchard. According to Miss Pritchard's testimony, which she would repeat dozens of times to increasingly skeptical audiences, the morning lessons proceeded normally. The girls worked on their French conjugations until 10 o'clock, then moved to the music room where Catherine practiced her scales on the pianoforte, while Abigail studied her arithmetic. At noon, they took lunch in the small dining room, a simple meal of chicken soup, fresh bread, and apple compote. Abigail ate well, Miss Pritchard noted, and seemed in good spirits. She had just received a letter from her brother Jonathan, which she read aloud to Catherine and their governess, laughing at his descriptions of his stuffy professors and the peculiar habits of his roommate. After lunch, Miss Pritchard dismissed the girls for their afternoon rest period, a daily ritual that allowed them 2 hours of private time before resuming their studies at 3 o'clock. Catherine went to her bedroom on the 2nd floor. Abigail, by all accounts, went to hers. But when Miss Pritchard knocked on Abigail's door at 3 o'clock, there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, calling the girl's name. Still nothing. Growing concerned, she opened the door to find the room empty. The bed was neatly made, untouched since the chambermaid had tidied it that morning. Abigail's books lay stacked on her desk. Her embroidery hoop sat by the window with a half-finished pattern of roses still stretched across it. Her wardrobe stood open, but Miss Pritchard could not determine if any clothing was missing. Everything appeared ordinary, undisturbed, as if Abigail had simply stepped out for a moment and would return at any second. But she never did. Miss Pritchard immediately searched the house, moving from room to room with increasing urgency. She checked the library, the morning room, the conservatory where Abigail sometimes liked to read among the ferns and orchids. She enlisted the help of the servants, sending them to search the basement, the attic, the garden, the stable. Catherine joined the search, her face growing pale as each location yielded nothing. By the time Thomas Hawthorne returned home at 5:30, the entire household was in a state of barely controlled panic. Thomas organized a more systematic search. He sent footmen to question the neighbors, dispatched stable boys to search the surrounding streets, and personally walked through every room of the house twice. He checked Abigail's room himself, looking for any clue, any sign of struggle or hurried departure. He found nothing out of place. Her jewelry box sat untouched on her vanity, containing a small collection of gold and pearl pieces. Her diary, which she kept in the top drawer of her nightstand, was locked as always. Thomas did not open it, respecting what little privacy a missing girl might still deserve. By nightfall, Thomas had no choice but to contact the authorities. Sheriff Daniel Warren arrived at the Hawthorne estate shortly after 8 o'clock. A heavy-set man in his 50s, with thinning grey hair and the weary expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker corners. He listened carefully as Thomas, Margaret, Catherine, and Miss Pritchard recounted the day's events. He took notes in a small leather-bound journal, asking occasional questions in a voice that remained professionally neutral. When the interviews concluded, Sheriff Warren walked through Abigail's room himself, his experienced eyes taking in details that others had missed. He noted that the window, which overlooked the back garden, was unlocked. The sash lifted easily when he tested it, revealing a drop of perhaps 12 feet to the soft earth below. He examined the ground outside with a lantern and found what might have been footprints, though the recent rain had softened the soil enough to make any definitive conclusions impossible. He also noted that the library's side door, which opened onto a narrow lane that ran between the Hawthorne property and the neighboring estate, had been left unlatched. Several servants admitted they used that entrance regularly, finding it more convenient than the main doors when running errands or taking deliveries. Sheriff Warren's initial assessment was that Abigail had left the house of her own accord, though whether she had gone willingly or under some form of coercion, he could not yet say. He promised to begin a thorough investigation in the morning, to question everyone who lived or worked in the vicinity, to send notices to neighboring towns and cities. He advised the Hawthornes to prepare themselves for a potentially long and difficult search. The next morning, handbills bearing Abigail's description appeared throughout Salem. 12 years old, slender build, blonde hair worn in braids, blue eyes, last seen wearing a grey wool dress with white collar and cuffs, black leather shoes. A reward of $500 was offered for information leading to her safe return. $500 was a fortune to most working people, enough to live on for a year or more, and Sheriff Warren hoped it would loosen tongues and sharpen memories. The response was overwhelming, but ultimately useless. Dozens of people came forward, claiming to have seen a girl matching Abigail's description. She had been spotted boarding a coach heading north to New Hampshire. She had been seen in the market district, arguing with a rough-looking man. She had been observed walking along the wharf, alone, staring out at the ships. Each claim was investigated and dismissed. The girl in New Hampshire turned out to be the daughter of a farmer from Vermont, traveling home after visiting relatives. The girl in the market was identified as the apprentice of a seamstress, running an errand for her employer. The girl at the wharf was never found, and the witness, a dock worker with a reputation for heavy drinking, could not provide any details beyond a vague description that could have applied to any number of young women. Days turned into weeks. The investigation, which had begun with such intensity, gradually lost momentum. Sheriff Warren continued to follow leads, but his visits to the Hawthorne estate became less frequent. The reward remained unclaimed. The handbills, once prominently displayed in shop windows and on public notice boards, began to fade and curl at the edges, eventually disappearing altogether as they were covered by announcements of other matters, newer urgencies. Life, as it always does, moved forward. Thomas Hawthorne returned to work at his mills, though colleagues noted that he seemed diminished somehow, his posture less commanding, his voice lacking its former authority. Margaret Hawthorne became a ghost in her own home, drifting from room to room in her black mourning dress, speaking in whispers when she spoke at all. Catherine's education continued under Miss Pritchard's supervision, but the joy had gone out of their lessons. Jonathan was called home from Harvard for a week, but returned to his studies at his father's insistence. The servants went about their duties with practiced efficiency, though the atmosphere in the house remained heavy with unspoken grief and unanswered questions. Winter arrived early that year. By late November, snow blanketed Salem, transforming the town into a monochrome landscape of white and grey. The Hawthorne estate, once a symbol of prosperity and social prominence, took on a different character. The windows, which had always blazed with light during the family's famous gatherings, now remained dark more often than not. The elaborate Christmas celebrations that the Hawthornes had traditionally hosted were quietly cancelled. Visitors became rare, as if the house itself had become contaminated by tragedy. As if the mystery of Abigail's disappearance might be contagious. It was during this bleak period that Henry Blackwood entered the story. Blackwood was a journalist from Boston, a man of 35 with sharp features and an even sharper mind. He had made a name for himself, writing about social issues and human interest stories for the Boston Herald. He had covered the trial of a prominent businessman accused of embezzling from his investors, had written exposés on the conditions in textile mills, had investigated claims of corruption in the city's police department. He had a reputation for tenacity and an almost supernatural ability to uncover facts that others missed or deliberately concealed. Blackwood had heard about the Hawthorne case through his network of sources and informants. Something about it intrigued him, though he could not initially articulate why. A missing girl from a wealthy family was not particularly unusual. Such cases occurred with distressing regularity, and most were eventually resolved in one way or another, usually tragically. But there was something about the particulars of this case, certain details that struck him as odd, inconsistencies that his instincts told him were worth exploring. He arrived in Salem on a grey December morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the wind, coming off the harbour, carried the sharp bite of impending snow. He took a room at the Essex Hotel on Washington Street, a modest establishment that catered to travelling salesmen and business visitors. He spent his first day walking through the town, getting a sense of its geography and character. Salem was a city built on maritime commerce and manufacturing, its wealth derived from the ships that crowded its harbour and the mills that lined its rivers. It was a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a single season, where social status was determined by the size of one's home and the cut of one's coat. That evening, Blackwood sat in the hotel's tavern and struck up conversations with the locals. He had learned long ago that the best information often came from informal sources, from people who would never speak to an official investigator, but who would happily gossip with a friendly stranger over a pint of ale. He mentioned the Hawthorne case casually, as if it were merely one topic among many, and was surprised by the reactions he received. Some people spoke of the family with obvious respect, praising Thomas Hawthorne's business acumen and the family's charitable contributions to local causes. Others were less generous, hinting at darker aspects of the family's history. There were whispers about the source of the Hawthorne fortune, suggestions that Thomas's grandfather had made his initial money not through legitimate trade, but through smuggling and privateering. There were comments about the labour practices at the Hawthorne mills, about workers dismissed without cause, about wages kept deliberately low to maximise profits. And there were rumours about Abigail herself, suggestions that she had been an unusual child, too clever for her own good, too curious about matters that did not concern her. One man, a former mill worker named Samuel Tucker, who had been dismissed from the Hawthorne operation 2 years earlier, had particularly interesting things to say. Tucker was in his 40s, with the calloused hands and stooped posture of someone who had spent decades engaged in hard physical labor. He spoke quietly, glancing around frequently as if afraid of being overheard, and his words came with the bitter edge of someone nursing old grievances. Tucker told Blackwood that he had worked at the Hawthorne mill for 15 years before being let go. The official reason given was a reduction in workforce due to economic conditions. But Tucker believed the real reason was that he had asked too many questions about certain aspects of the mill's operations. He mentioned shipments that arrived and departed at odd hours, packages that were handled separately from the regular textile goods, workers who came and went without appearing on any official roster. When he had raised these concerns with the mill's foreman, he was told to mind his own business. When he persisted, he was dismissed. Blackwood listened carefully, making mental notes but not writing anything down, knowing that the appearance of official recording could shut down the conversation immediately. He bought Tucker another ale and asked about Abigail. Had Tucker ever met her? Tucker nodded slowly. Yes, he had encountered her once. About a year before he was dismissed. She had come to the mill with her father, a rare visit that had caused considerable stir among the workers. Most of the girls from wealthy families never set foot in such places, considering them beneath their notice or too unpleasant for their delicate sensibilities. But Abigail had walked through the mill floor with evident interest, asking questions about the machinery, the processes, the workers' schedules. Her father had seemed annoyed by her curiosity, hurrying her along, but the girl had been persistent. What struck Tucker most was a brief exchange he had witnessed between Abigail and one of the workers, a young woman named Rose, who operated one of the looms. Rose was African American, a free woman who had come north from Virginia several years earlier. She was an excellent worker, quick and reliable, but she kept to herself and rarely spoke to anyone beyond what was necessary for her job. Abigail had approached Rose directly, ignoring her father's attempts to steer her away, and had asked Rose about her work, her life, where she came from. The conversation had lasted only a minute or two before Thomas Hawthorne physically pulled his daughter away, but Tucker had seen the expression on Abigail's face. It was an expression of intense interest and something else, something that Tucker struggled to define, understanding perhaps, or recognition. Blackwood thanked Tucker for his time and information. The next morning, he began his formal investigation by visiting Sheriff Warren's office. Warren received him with obvious reluctance, the kind of wariness that law enforcement officials often showed toward journalists. He agreed to discuss the case, but made it clear that he considered it essentially closed. Abigail Hawthorne was gone, he said. Whether she had run away, been abducted, or met with foul play, the trail had gone cold. Without new evidence or witnesses, there was nothing more he could do. Blackwood asked to review the case file. Warren hesitated but ultimately agreed, perhaps calculating that cooperation with the press might be preferable to antagonizing them. The file was disappointingly thin. It contained witness statements from the household staff and family members, notes from Warren's initial investigation, copies of the handbills, and a list of reported sightings, all of which had been investigated and dismissed. There was also a brief notation about the unlocked window and unlatched library door, but no follow-up investigation appeared to have been conducted. What caught Blackwood's attention was what was not in the file. There was no mention of Abigail's diary, which Thomas Hawthorne had noted during the initial search. There was no detailed inventory of her possessions to determine if anything was missing besides the clothes she presumably wore when she left. There was no investigation into the family's business affairs or personal relationships beyond the most superficial inquiries. It was as if the investigation had stopped just as it was beginning to probe beneath the surface. When Blackwood asked Warren about these omissions, the sheriff's expression hardened. He said that Thomas Hawthorne was a prominent citizen who deserved respect and privacy during his family's tragedy. He said that without evidence of foul play, there was no justification for treating the family like suspects. He said that a girl from a good family running away was not unprecedented, that young women sometimes made foolish choices, that the fault likely lay with Abigail herself rather than with any external actor. Blackwood left the sheriff's office with a growing sense that something was being deliberately concealed. He spent the afternoon researching the Hawthorne family's history at the town's Historical Society and the Public Records Office. He discovered that the family's wealth was indeed substantial, built over 3 generations through shipping, trade, and eventually manufacturing. Thomas Hawthorne's grandfather, Nathaniel, had been a ship captain during the Revolutionary War, afterward transitioning into merchant trading. His son, William, had expanded into textiles during the early days of industrialization. Thomas had inherited a profitable enterprise and had made it even more successful through shrewd investments and ruthless business practices. But Blackwood also uncovered darker elements of the family's history. Nathaniel Hawthorne's ships had been involved in the triangle trade during the late 18th century, carrying rum to Africa, enslaved people to the Caribbean and American South, and sugar and molasses back to New England. While the family had officially exited that trade after the turn of the century, there were suggestions in old shipping manifests and port records that connections to the slave economy had continued in less direct forms. The Hawthorne mills purchased cotton from southern plantations, and there were regular business correspondence and visits between Thomas Hawthorne and plantation owners. As December progressed and the year moved toward its close, Blackwood continued his investigation methodically. He interviewed former and current employees of the Hawthorne mills, though many were reluctant to speak openly. He talked to neighbors, shopkeepers, servants who had worked in other households on Washington Square. He spent hours in taverns and coffee houses, listening to gossip and speculation. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, though it was fragmentary and often contradictory. Several people mentioned that Abigail had been unusually interested in social reform movements. She had been seen reading copies of The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper, which she somehow obtained despite her father's disapproval. She had asked pointed questions about slavery and the economic connections between northern industry and southern agriculture. She had expressed sympathy for the growing women's rights movement, mentioning the recent convention in Seneca Falls. These interests had caused tension within the household, particularly with her father, who viewed such ideas as dangerous and inappropriate for a young woman of her station. Blackwood also learned about Rose, the mill worker Tucker had mentioned. He tracked her down to a boarding house in a working-class neighborhood near the waterfront. Rose was reluctant to speak with him at first, but when he explained that he was investigating Abigail's disappearance, she agreed to a conversation. They met in a small park on a bitterly cold afternoon, both bundled against the wind, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Rose was in her mid-20s, with intelligent eyes that held a mixture of caution and sadness. She confirmed that she had met Abigail at the mill about a year before the girl's disappearance. The encounter had been brief, just a few minutes of conversation, but it had left an impression on both of them. Abigail had asked Rose about her background, her journey north, her experiences. Rose had been surprised by the girl's genuine interest and lack of condescension. Most white people, if they acknowledged her at all, did so with either hostility or pity. Abigail had been different, asking real questions and listening to the answers with evident concentration. After that initial meeting, Abigail had found ways to see Rose again. She would sometimes visit the mill on pretexts, ostensibly to bring her father lunch or deliver a message, but really to speak with Rose for a few minutes. These conversations had to be conducted carefully. Away from the eyes of supervisors and other workers, brief exchanges in stairwells or storage rooms, Abigail asked about slavery, about what it meant to live as a black woman in America, about Rose's hopes for the future. Rose, for her part, was initially wary, but gradually came to trust the girl's sincerity. What Rose told Blackwood next made his pulse quicken. In the months before Abigail disappeared, their conversations had taken on a different character. Abigail had begun asking more specific questions about the mill's operations, about shipments and schedules. She had mentioned seeing certain things at her home, documents and correspondence that had troubled her, though she would not specify exactly what. She had said that her father was involved in something wrong, something that went against everything she believed was right and just. She had said she wanted to do something about it, though again she would not elaborate. The last time Rose saw Abigail was in early October, less than 2 weeks before the girl vanished. Abigail had appeared agitated, almost frightened. She told Rose that she had discovered something important, something that proved what she had suspected. She said she was going to confront her father, to demand that he change his ways. Rose had warned her against this, had told her that men like Thomas Hawthorne did not respond well to being challenged, especially not by their own daughters. But Abigail had been determined, insisting that she could not remain silent, that some truths demanded action, regardless of the personal cost. Rose had not heard from Abigail again. When news of the girl's disappearance spread through Salem, Rose had felt sick with worry and guilt. She had considered going to Sheriff Warren, telling him about her conversations with Abigail, but she had held back. As a black woman in a white-dominated town, she had no real protection under the law, no guarantee that she would be believed or treated fairly. Moreover, she feared retaliation from Thomas Hawthorne, who had the power to have her fired, arrested on false charges, or worse. So she had stayed silent, carrying the weight of her knowledge alone. After speaking with Rose, Blackwood knew he needed to find a way to gain access to the Hawthorne house, and ideally to Abigail's room and her diary. He could not simply present himself at the door and request entry. Thomas Hawthorne would never agree to speak with a journalist investigating his daughter's disappearance, especially not one who was likely to ask uncomfortable questions about his business dealings. Instead, Blackwood crafted a more subtle approach. He arranged an introduction through a mutual acquaintance, a Boston businessman who had dealings with Hawthorne and who owed Blackwood a favor for a story the journalist had declined to publish years earlier. The introduction was made at a private club in Salem, a wood-paneled establishment where men of commerce gathered to smoke cigars, drink imported whiskey, and discuss affairs of state and business. Blackwood presented himself as a writer working on a book about New England's industrial development, interested in speaking with successful manufacturers like Hawthorne to understand their perspectives and experiences. Thomas Hawthorne agreed to an interview, perhaps seeing it as an opportunity to burnish his reputation, or perhaps simply flattered by the attention. They met at Hawthorne's office in one of his mills, a spacious room with large windows overlooking the factory floor below. Hawthorne was in his late 40s, tall and lean with grey threading through his dark hair. His face was handsome but severe, marked by lines that suggested habitual frowning. His manner was formal and controlled, each gesture and word carefully measured. For the first hour, they discussed business matters. Hawthorne spoke with evident pride about his mills, their efficiency and profitability, the quality of their products. He talked about the challenges of managing a large workforce, the constant pressure to reduce costs and increase output, the necessity of maintaining discipline and order. He expressed views that were common among industrialists of his class and time, a belief in the natural hierarchy of society, in the virtue of hard work, and the moral failings of those who could not or would not succeed within the existing economic system. Blackwood listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that encouraged Hawthorne to elaborate. He gradually steered the conversation toward more personal topics, asking about Hawthorne's family, his children, his hopes for their futures. Hawthorne spoke of Jonathan with evident satisfaction, pleased that his son was following the expected path toward taking over the family business. He mentioned Catherine in passing, noting that she was a dutiful daughter who would make a suitable marriage when the time came. When Blackwood gently raised the subject of Abigail, Hawthorne's demeanor changed perceptibly. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened, and a flash of something darker passed across his face before he regained his composure. He said that Abigail's disappearance remained a source of profound grief for the entire family. He said that every possible effort had been made to find her, that the authorities had conducted a thorough investigation, that he held out hope she would be found alive and well. His words were appropriate, but his tone suggested something else, an undertone of anger or perhaps guilt. Blackwood expressed sympathetic understanding and asked if there were any theories about what might have happened. Hawthorne's response was carefully neutral. He said that young women sometimes made impulsive decisions, sometimes fell under the influence of unsuitable people or dangerous ideas. He said that Abigail had been a curious child, perhaps too curious, asking questions about things that did not concern her. He said that he blamed himself for not providing better guidance, for not recognizing the warning signs earlier. "What warning signs?" Blackwood asked. Hawthorne hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, he said that Abigail had developed inappropriate interests, reading radical publications, expressing sympathy for causes that threatened the social order. He had tried to correct these tendencies, to help her understand that her proper role was within the family and society as it existed, not in trying to change or challenge it. But she had been stubborn, willful, refusing to listen to reason. They had argued about it, Hawthorne admitted. In the weeks before her disappearance, there had been multiple confrontations. Abigail had accused him of being complicit in injustice, of profiting from human suffering. She had demanded that he end his business relationships with Southern planters, that he speak out publicly against slavery, that he support reform movements. He had refused, of course, explaining that business was business, that one could not allow personal sentiment to interfere with economic necessity, that maintaining their family's position required making practical rather than idealistic choices. Their final argument had occurred just days before Abigail vanished. She had come to him with certain documents, letters and ledgers that she had found in his study. Hawthorne did not specify what these documents contained, but his expression suggested that they had revealed something significant. She had confronted him with evidence of his involvement in what she called immoral activities. He had been furious at her intrusion into his private affairs, at her presumption in questioning his decisions. He had told her that she was a foolish child who understood nothing of the real world, that her naive idealism would only lead to ruin. She had called him a hypocrite and worse, saying things that no daughter should say to her father. After that confrontation, Abigail had retreated to her room. Over the following days, she had been withdrawn and quiet, barely speaking to anyone in the household. Hawthorne assumed she was sulking, waiting for her to apologize and acknowledge her wrongdoing. Instead, she had disappeared. As Blackwood listened to this account, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. He asked, as casually as he could manage, what had become of Abigail's personal effects, particularly any writings or correspondence she might have left behind. Hawthorne said that everything remained in her room, untouched since the day she vanished. He had not had the heart to go through her possessions, and neither had his wife. The room stood as a kind of shrine, waiting for Abigail's return. Blackwood saw his opportunity. He expressed interest in seeing the room, explaining that understanding the environment where Abigail lived might provide insights into her state of mind. He suggested that details about her daily life could be valuable for the book he was writing, offering a human dimension to the broader story of industrial development and social change. Hawthorne was reluctant, but after some persuasion, he agreed. Perhaps some part of him wanted the truth to emerge, or perhaps he simply calculated that cooperation would look better than obstruction. They went to the Hawthorne estate that same afternoon. The house was as imposing as Blackwood had expected, a monument to wealth and status. A servant admitted them, and Hawthorne led the way upstairs to the second floor. They passed the famous family portrait in the front parlour, and Blackwood paused to study it. The figures stared back at him with expressions that now seemed haunted rather than proud. Abigail's face, in particular, drew his attention. The artist had captured something in her eyes, an intensity that suggested depths of feeling and thought beyond what one would expect in a child. Abigail's room was at the end of a long hallway. Hawthorne unlocked the door with a key he carried in his pocket, and they stepped inside. The air was stale and cold, undisturbed by any human presence for months. Everything was exactly as Miss Pritchard had described it on the day of the disappearance, preserved like an exhibit in a museum. The bed neatly made, the books stacked on the desk, the embroidery by the window. Blackwood moved through the room slowly, taking in every detail. He examined the books on her shelf, a mixture of literature, history, and moral philosophy, including several volumes on social reform that would have been considered radical. He noted the embroidery pattern, the roses half-finished, each stitch precise and careful. He looked out the window at the garden below, calculating the distance to the ground, considering how easy or difficult it would have been for someone to climb down undetected. When he came to the nightstand, he saw the locked diary in the top drawer. He asked Hawthorne if it had ever been opened. Hawthorne said no, that he had respected his daughter's privacy even in her absence. Blackwood suggested that perhaps the diary should be examined, that it might contain clues about Abigail's intentions or state of mind. Hawthorne's face darkened. He said that whatever his daughter had written was her own business, not to be violated by strangers or exposed to public scrutiny. Blackwood did not press the point immediately. Instead, he continued his examination of the room, noting other details. A small wooden box on the dresser contained shells and stones, the kind of natural treasures children collect. A shelf held dolls and toys, remnants of a younger childhood that Abigail had presumably outgrown but could not quite abandon. And on the desk, partially hidden beneath a stack of papers, was a pamphlet titled The American Anti-Slavery Almanac. After perhaps 20 minutes, Hawthorne said they should leave. His discomfort was evident, and Blackwood did not want to risk alienating him completely. They returned downstairs, and Hawthorne showed him to the door. Before departing, Blackwood thanked him for his cooperation and expressed hope that the mystery of Abigail's disappearance might yet be solved. Hawthorne's response was non-committal, a curt nod and a reminder that he was a busy man with limited time for such matters. That evening, Blackwood sat in his hotel room and organized his thoughts. He now had a clearer picture of what had happened, though critical pieces remained missing. Abigail had discovered evidence of her father's involvement in something she considered immoral, almost certainly related to slavery or the slave trade. She had confronted him and been rebuffed. She had then either run away or been removed from the house by force or deception. But where had she gone? And was she still alive? The next morning, Blackwood paid a visit to the offices of the Salem Gazette. He had learned that newspaper editors often possessed valuable information that never made it into print, local knowledge and gossip that could point investigations in useful directions. He met with the editor, a rotund man named Hiram Fletcher, who had run the paper for 20 years. Fletcher was initially guarded, but when Blackwood mentioned he was investigating the Hawthorne case, the editor's demeanor changed. Fletcher said that he had always suspected there was more to Abigail's disappearance than the official story suggested. He had received anonymous letters in the weeks following her vanishing, hints and allegations that he had not been able to verify or publish without risking libel suits. One letter claimed that Abigail had not run away, but had been sent somewhere against her will. Another suggested that Thomas Hawthorne had business connections that went far beyond legitimate textile manufacturing. A third, received just before Blackwood's arrival in Salem, stated that Abigail was alive but imprisoned, held somewhere she could not escape or call for help. Fletcher had dismissed most of these letters as the work of cranks or people with grudges against the Hawthorne family. But the last one had included specific details that gave him pause. The writer claimed to have seen documents proving that Thomas Hawthorne was involved in the illegal slave trade, helping to transport enslaved people from Africa to Cuba and Brazil, despite international treaties prohibiting such activities. The Hawthorne mills, the letter alleged, served as a front for these operations, with certain shipments containing human cargo hidden among bales of cotton and textile goods. If this were true, it would explain many things, including why Abigail might have been desperate enough to confront her father, and why Thomas Hawthorne might have taken drastic action to silence her. But Fletcher had no proof, and without evidence, he could not publish such explosive accusations. He had locked the letters in his desk drawer, unsure what to do with them. Blackwood asked to see the letters. Fletcher hesitated but ultimately retrieved them from his locked drawer. There were 5 in total, all written in different hands, all unsigned. The most recent and detailed one was written in an educated script, suggesting someone with learning and social position. It described specific ships, dates, and destinations, claiming that the schooner Providence and the brig Meridian, both registered to companies owned by Hawthorne family interests, had been engaged in illegal slave trading operations as recently as the previous summer. This information gave Blackwood a new direction for his investigation. He spent the next several days at the Customs House and Maritime Records Office, digging through shipping manifests and port records. The work was tedious, involving hours of reading through ledgers written in cramped handwriting, but his persistence eventually paid off. He found records for both the Providence and the Meridian, showing voyages to West Africa and then to Cuba, with cargo descriptions that were suspiciously vague. He also found evidence of payments to customs officials that might have been bribes to overlook irregularities in manifests or inspections. With this information in hand, Blackwood decided it was time to apply more direct pressure. He composed a letter to Thomas Hawthorne, not threatening but pointed, indicating that he had uncovered information about certain business activities that Abigail had also discovered. He suggested that a frank conversation might be in both their interests, that there were ways of telling this story that would be more or less damaging to the Hawthorne family's reputation. He sent the letter by messenger and waited for a response. The response came the next evening. A carriage arrived at Blackwood's hotel, and the driver delivered a note requesting that he come to the Hawthorne estate immediately. Blackwood went, knowing he was walking into a potentially dangerous situation, but convinced that this was his best chance to learn the truth. Thomas Hawthorne received him in the library, a large room lined with books from floor to ceiling. A fire burned in the marble fireplace, but the warmth did not reach the corners of the room. Hawthorne stood by the window, his back to Blackwood initially, staring out at the darkened garden. When he turned, his face was haggard, as if he had aged years in the short time since their previous meeting. Hawthorne did not waste time with pleasantries. He said that Blackwood had been making inquiries that were dangerous for both of them. He said that there were powerful interests involved, people who would not hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their operations. He said that Blackwood should drop his investigation and leave Salem before something unfortunate happened. Blackwood responded that he could not and would not abandon the search for truth. He said that Abigail Hawthorne deserved justice, that if she had been punished or silenced for standing up against wrongdoing, then that crime needed to be exposed regardless of the consequences. He asked Hawthorne directly what had happened to his daughter. The question hung in the air between them. For a long moment, Hawthorne said nothing, his face working through a series of emotions: anger, grief, guilt, fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said that Abigail had indeed discovered evidence of his involvement in the slave trade. She had found correspondence and account books that detailed the operations, ships traveling to Africa with manufactured goods, returning with human beings who were then transported to markets in Cuba and Brazil, where slavery remained legal. It was not the family's primary business, but it was highly profitable, generating income that helped sustain the mills during difficult economic periods. It was also deeply illegal and morally indefensible, which was why it had been kept strictly secret. When Abigail confronted him with this evidence, Hawthorne had tried to justify it, to explain that business required making difficult choices, that sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with survival in a competitive world. But Abigail had been uncompromising. She said that no amount of money could justify human bondage, that he was directly responsible for untold suffering and death. She said that she would not remain silent, that she would go to the authorities and the newspapers, that she would expose what he had done regardless of the consequences to the family. Hawthorne had panicked. He could not allow his daughter to destroy everything his family had built over generations, but he also could not bring himself to harm her directly. So he had made a terrible decision. He had contacted his business associates, men involved in the same illegal trade, and they had arranged for Abigail to be taken away. On the afternoon she disappeared, Abigail had not left her room on her own. She had been drugged with laudanum mixed into her afternoon tea, a dose carefully calculated to render her unconscious but not kill her. While the household was quiet during the rest period, men had entered through the library's side door, climbed the servants' staircase to the second floor, taken Abigail from her room, and carried her down and out of the house. The unlocked window and footprints were deliberate misdirection, meant to suggest she had left on her own. She had been taken to a private sanatorium in western Massachusetts, an institution that catered to wealthy families who needed to hide inconvenient relatives. Abigail was registered under a false name, described as suffering from nervous hysteria and delusions. She was held in a locked wing, allowed no visitors, given no opportunity to send messages or escape. Hawthorne received regular reports on her condition, but had never visited her. He told himself that this was temporary, that eventually Abigail would come to understand the necessity of keeping their family's secrets, that she would be released once the immediate danger had passed. But months had gone by, and Abigail had not broken. The report said that she remained defiant, refusing to recant her accusations or promise silence. The doctors recommended increasing doses of sedatives to make her more manageable, perhaps even more extreme measures to break her will. Hawthorne had authorized these treatments, though each decision weighed more heavily on his conscience. As Blackwood listened to this confession, he felt a mixture of revulsion and pity. Here was a man who had sacrificed his own daughter to protect his wealth and reputation, who had condemned her to imprisonment and medical torture rather than face the consequences of his actions. But here also was a man clearly tormented by what he had done, hollowed out by guilt and regret. Blackwood asked where exactly Abigail was being held. Hawthorne gave him the name and location of the sanatorium, a place called the Riverside Institute near the town of Springfield. He said that Abigail could be freed, that he would provide written authorization for her release. But he pleaded with Blackwood not to publish the full story, not to expose the slave trading operations. He said that such exposure would not only destroy his family, but also implicate dozens of other prominent men, that it would create a scandal of enormous proportions. Blackwood made no promises. He said that his first priority was ensuring Abigail's safety and freedom, that decisions about what to publish could come later. He demanded that Hawthorne provide him with the documents necessary to secure Abigail's release immediately. Hawthorne agreed and spent the next hour writing letters and gathering papers that would prove his identity and authority. The next morning, Blackwood took the early train to Springfield. The journey took most of the day, traveling through snow-covered countryside, small towns appearing and disappearing outside the train windows. He arrived in Springfield in late afternoon and hired a carriage to take him to the Riverside Institute, located several miles outside the town proper. The sanatorium was a large stone building set on extensive grounds surrounded by high walls. It looked more like a prison than a place of healing, though Blackwood supposed that for many of the people confined there, the distinction was meaningless. He presented himself at the main entrance, showed the documents Hawthorne had provided, and demanded to see the patient registered under the false name given to Abigail. The director of the institution, a Dr. Edmund Carlyle, was initially resistant. He spoke of patient privacy and medical protocols, of the need for family members to make decisions about care and release. But Blackwood was insistent, and the documents Hawthorne had provided were legally unassailable. Carlyle had no choice but to comply. Abigail Hawthorne was brought to Dr. Carlyle's office 20 minutes later, escorted by 2 attendants. The sight of her shocked Blackwood. This was not the bright-faced girl from the family portrait. This was a young woman who had been systematically broken down, her spirit dimmed, but not quite extinguished. She was painfully thin, her blonde hair dull and roughly cut, her blue eyes circled with dark shadows. She wore a plain grey institutional dress and moved with the shuffling gait of someone heavily medicated. When she saw Blackwood, a stranger to her, she showed no reaction at first. But when he introduced himself and explained that he had come to take her home, that he knew what had happened to her and why, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or hope, or simply the desperate relief of someone who had been screaming into silence for months and had finally been heard. Dr. Carlyle protested that Abigail was not well, that she required continued treatment and supervision, that releasing her would be medically irresponsible. Blackwood ignored him, instead speaking directly to Abigail. He asked if she wanted to leave this place, if she understood that she was being freed. She nodded slowly, her movements sluggish from the drugs, but her intention clear. The paperwork for her release took another hour. Carlyle insisted on having everything documented properly, protecting himself from potential legal liability. Blackwood used the time to make arrangements for their travel back to Salem, including securing a private compartment on the evening train and sending a telegram ahead to arrange for a doctor to examine Abigail upon their arrival. They left the Riverside Institute as darkness fell. Abigail said nothing during the carriage ride to the train station or during the long journey back to Salem. She sat by the window, staring out at the passing darkness, occasionally touching her own face or arms, as if confirming her own physical reality. Blackwood did not push her to speak, understanding that she needed time to process her freedom, to believe that this was not another cruel trick. They arrived in Salem late that night. Blackwood took her directly to a doctor he trusted, a man named Peter Hammond, who had a reputation for discretion and compassion. Dr. Hammond examined Abigail, noted the effects of prolonged sedation and poor nutrition, prescribed a regimen of rest and proper food and gentle exercise. He said that her physical recovery would take weeks or months, her psychological recovery perhaps much longer. But she was young and fundamentally strong, and with proper care she could heal. The question remained of where Abigail should stay. She could not return to her father's house, not immediately, and perhaps not ever. She had no other family in Salem who could take her in without creating complications. Blackwood solved this problem by arranging for her to stay with Rose, the mill worker she had befriended. Rose's boarding house room was small but clean, and Rose herself welcomed Abigail without hesitation, offering the kind of unconditional support that had nothing to do with social position or family connections. Over the following days, as Abigail slowly regained her strength and the fog of medication began to lift, she told her story to Blackwood. She described finding the documents in her father's study, understanding what they meant, feeling both horrified and betrayed. She described confronting him, pleading with him to stop his involvement in such evil, being dismissed and patronized. She described her decision to go public with what she knew, believing that moral obligation required action regardless of personal cost. She remembered little of her actual abduction, just drinking her afternoon tea and then waking up in a strange place, disoriented and frightened. She described the weeks and months at the Riverside Institute, the forced medications, the isolation, the doctors who told her she was delusional and needed treatment for her condition. She had tried to maintain her sense of self, to remember who she was and what she knew, but it had been difficult when everyone around her insisted that her reality was false, that her memories were symptoms of illness. What had sustained her was her conviction that what her father was doing was wrong, that some truths were worth any price. She had refused to recant or promise silence, even when it meant more medication, more confinement, more of the deadening routine that was designed to erase individuality and will. She had endured because she believed that eventually the truth would emerge, that justice would prevail even if she did not live to see it. Now that she was free, Abigail wanted to complete what she had started. She wanted to expose the illegal slave trading operations, to ensure that her father and his associates were held accountable. She understood that this would mean scandal for her family, that her own reputation would be affected, that her life would never be the same, but she was willing to pay that price. Blackwood spent several more weeks in Salem, gathering additional evidence and preparing his story. With Abigail's testimony and the documents she had originally discovered, which Hawthorne was compelled to surrender under threat of criminal prosecution, Blackwood had everything he needed to write a comprehensive exposé. He conducted additional interviews with sailors who had worked on the slave trading ships, with port officials who had been bribed to look the other way, with other business associates who confirmed the scope of the illegal operations. The article appeared in the Boston Herald in late January 1850. It was titled, "The Slave Trade's Hidden Face: How New England Wealth Built on Human Bondage." It detailed the Hawthorne case specifically, but also exposed a broader network of northern businessmen who continued to profit from slavery despite its abolition in their own states and despite international agreements prohibiting the slave trade. The response was immediate and explosive. Thomas Hawthorne was arrested and charged with multiple violations of federal law. Other men named in the article faced similar charges. The scandal dominated newspapers throughout New England and beyond, prompting calls for more aggressive enforcement of anti-slavery laws and renewed debates about the moral foundations of American capitalism. The Hawthorne mills were seized by federal authorities, and the family's wealth was substantially diminished by legal fees, fines, and the collapse of their business empire. Margaret Hawthorne, never robust in the best of times, declined rapidly after the scandal broke. She died in March 1850, some said of a broken heart, though the official cause was listed as pneumonia. Jonathan Hawthorne withdrew from Harvard in disgrace, unable to continue his studies under the weight of his family's notoriety. Catherine Hawthorne eventually married a minister from Vermont and moved away from Salem, changing her name and trying to build a new life free from the shadow of her father's crimes. Thomas Hawthorne stood trial in federal court in the summer of 1850. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was convicted on multiple counts. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and fined an amount that consumed what remained of his family's wealth. He served 7 years before dying of heart failure in 1857, never fully recovering from the destruction of everything he had built and valued. Abigail Hawthorne slowly rebuilt her life. She lived with Rose for several years, the two women forming a deep friendship based on shared experiences of being silenced and marginalized. She became active in both the abolitionist and women's rights movements, using her story as an example of why freedom and justice required constant vigilance and courage. She never married, dedicating herself instead to causes she believed in, writing and speaking publicly about the intersection of gender, class, and racial oppression. The family portrait remained in the Hawthorne estate through the legal proceedings, eventually purchased by a collector who valued it more for its historical significance than its artistic merit. It hung in various private collections over the decades, a reminder of a family destroyed by moral failure and a daughter who refused to be complicit in evil, even at tremendous personal cost. Henry Blackwood continued his career as an investigative journalist, becoming increasingly focused on social reform issues. He wrote a book about the Hawthorne case titled The Price of Silence: How One Girl's Courage Exposed America's Hidden Shame, which became a bestseller and further cemented his reputation. He corresponded with Abigail for the rest of his life, maintaining a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. The broader impact of the Hawthorne scandal was significant, though not transformative. It exposed the reality that Northern complicity in slavery extended far beyond cotton consumption and political compromises, that wealthy and respectable men were directly profiting from the buying and selling of human beings, even as they publicly deplored the institution. This revelation contributed to the growing sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War, adding moral complexity to arguments that often focused on economic and political factors. The case also highlighted questions about the rights and agency of women and children within patriarchal family structures. Abigail's imprisonment in the sanatorium, though extreme, was not fundamentally different from other forms of control exerted by fathers and husbands over daughters and wives who challenged their authority. The scandal prompted discussions about legal reforms that would give women more protection and autonomy, though meaningful change would be slow in coming. In the final analysis, the story of Abigail Hawthorne's disappearance and return was about the cost of freedom and the price of conscience. It demonstrated that speaking truth to power required courage that few possessed, and that institutional structures of family, business, and medicine could be turned against those who threatened the status quo. But it also showed that such structures were not invincible, that individual acts of moral courage could pierce through layers of deception and denial, that truth, though it could be suppressed temporarily, could not be permanently silenced. The family portrait, with its frozen moment of apparent prosperity and respectability, became a symbol of the gap between public appearance and private reality. The 5 figures staring out from the canvas represented not a triumph of family unity, but the fractures that would eventually tear them apart. And at the center of it all was Abigail, the vanished daughter who refused to vanish, whose absence was louder than presence, whose silence spoke more powerfully than any words. For those who looked at the portrait with knowledge of what came after, Abigail's expression took on new meaning. The brightness in her eyes was not innocence but awareness, a recognition that the world she had been born into was built on foundations of injustice that could not be ignored or rationalized away. The slight tension in her posture suggested not comfort, but readiness, as if she were already preparing to step out of the frame, to move beyond the role assigned to her, to become something other than what her family and society expected. In the years following the scandal, the portrait passed through various hands, sometimes displayed prominently, sometimes stored in attics and forgotten. But it endured, as Abigail herself had endured, as a testament to the truth that freedom is never given freely, that it must be claimed and defended, that its price is often paid in blood and suffering, but that price, as Abigail understood, was worth paying. The chilling mystery of the vanished daughter in the Hawthorne family portrait was ultimately not a mystery of where she had gone, but of why, and in answering that question, the story revealed fundamental truths about American society in 1849 and beyond, about the systems of power that sustained injustice and the individuals who had the courage to resist them.